I know that there are many more attractive sessions going on, so I'm really thanking you, both of us, Pauline and myself, thank you for being with us. We need to start because it's a short session. Just wanted to give you, by way of background, that alliances exactly at this forum in 2017 were set up. And this one was the Alliance for Assessment and Impact for Learning. A lot of us who were in the assessment space and technology space were very excited. We were 9 members in this alliance, and from, I think, at least 3, if not 4 continents. And 6 organizations participated for these 4 case studies. By way of a backdrop, and all of you are so familiar with it, that this comes as a response to the learning crisis and the crisis of education that all of us are trying to do something for, looking for solutions. Yesterday, as we were preparing for this session, I was sharing with Pauline that there's been this whole initiative looking at global learning and sharing infrastructure. We're talking about infrastructures that have the potential for scaling, which are innovative, coordinated, and have a local context through which they can be connected. We also feel it is important that in this education ecosystem that we are talking about, we try to look at possibilities for leapfrogging. And when we talk about that, technologies are seen as the obvious answer. In a forum like this, we also see the amazing innovations that are taking place. We've heard this morning about the winners of various innovations and so on. So while technologies are extremely attractive, there are, of course, issues which are around it which need to be addressed. I would like to hand over right now to Pauline, because we want to focus on issues of principles for accountability and action through technologies, and Pauline will introduce you to those.
Great, thank you. And as Baela said, thank you for all being here. Yesterday morning, we heard from Kevin that we need to keep pace with technology. Education is the only way to do that. But I think one question I have, as being a bit of a cynic, is technology controlling us? Are we aware of the dangers, and are we doing enough to address those potential pitfalls? So I just want to start by asking, who's wearing their tracker? Put up your hand if you're wearing your tracker. Who knows what the data is being used for that's being collected in this tracker? Put your hand up if you know what it's being used for. Oh, nobody. Put your hand up if you know who has access to the data that's in this tracker. Am I making you a bit worried now? And who knows, probably not because we don't know who's accessing it, who knows how they're using these data? None of us. Oh, there's one person who knows everything, so that's good. We can come back to you later. Oh, you're just waving, okay. So nobody knows. And I think this was actually our starting point, in a way. When we were gathering last year at this conference, a number of us were gathering for an alliance on assessment for impact. And we were debating, what should we focus on? There are many different areas. As Baela says, we know that there's this learning crisis. We know we need to do something about it. What was a key issue? And we thought, we obviously had foresight, actually, because we didn't know that this particular conference this year was going to be focusing on technology. So we obviously had foresight, and we thought, well, one thing that maybe brought us together as a mutual, both seeing it as an opportunity but also a concern, was how technology is being used in the collection and use of data in the education sector. So moving away from how we're using it in the classroom to teach, or whether we're getting rid of classrooms and teachers, but more collecting data to know as a barometer of the education system itself. Is anybody here involved in using technology to collect education data? So there's some people who are using it, so you guys still don't know what the tracker's used for any more than I do. And Are there any ed tech companies here? There's some ed tech companies here, and you don't know what it's used for either. Wow, okay, so it's not just those of us who aren't on that side that don't know. So I think one of the things we realized was that some of these things are very fast-moving, that technology is very fast-moving, and some of those who work in the education space can't always keep up with you. So we were realizing that maybe there was a bit of a sort of disconnect between what we were wanting to use technology for collecting and analyzing data, and how it might actually be used. At least it was our ignorance rather than necessarily anything problematic. So we started discussing amongst ourselves, and as Baela said, there were a number of organizations involved in our alliance who have been using technology in a variety of ways. So Lucy Lake, who's the CEO from CamFed here, is one of the case studies. We had 3 other case studies, one of them actually the Varkey Foundation themselves, one from the Aga Khan Foundation Network, and one from the government of Punjab in Pakistan. So we had a variety of different case studies, which when you go onto the app or online on the Varkey Foundation website, you can see this paper. So I've only even got it in black and white, so see how low-tech I am. And in this paper, you'll see that, if you wouldn't mind putting the slide up, that there are actually, what we found out along the way of our journey of working together to identify what we might see as some of the opportunities and pitfalls, there are a number of principles for digital development. So who is aware of these principles? Has anyone come across these principles? So, well, Lucy, you would be. But there's somebody at the back. So have you used these principles? Maybe we could take the microphone. Yeah, thank you. Somebody got the microphone?
Hello. Yes, we do use them. So open source, for example.
So, sorry, what's your organisation?
USTAD Mobile.
Right, okay. So,
yeah.
So there we have a real-life example. And it would be interesting, maybe we'll come back to you in a little while to find out what your experience of using them have been. But before we move on, I'd like to ask Lucy Lake from CamFed just to say a few words about CamFed's experience of using technology in the work that they're doing, and in relation to what we're discussing here, and how the principles did or didn't meet your needs.
Thanks, Pauline. Well, I think for us, the issue has always been that the success of rolling out technology and use of mobile technology in the area of data gathering and analysis was that first and foremost we had to have the principles in place, the kind of governance principles around the way that we were operating in our partnerships and in program delivery before we could then look at how mobile technology could be introduced into that infrastructure to enable data gathering. So it was the principles that needed to hold fast first and foremost, because I think otherwise there is a risk that one does lose control of the data, and one does then start to ask the questions around who has access to the data, how is it being used. But I think if you have the principles in place fundamentally and from the outset, then you are able to answer those questions. And actually, last year we were recognized by the technology platform that we were using, that we were adapting for that purpose. And we won an award from them because of the accountability that we had enabled through that platform. And it wasn't accountability to donors or to governments that I think many people, when I use the word accountability, assume. It was because of the accountability to our clients that we had enabled. Our clients being vulnerable young people in marginalized communities, and how you can make data accessible to them. So I think it was turning around the opportunity for how data is used and shared.
Thank you, Lucy. I think that sort of raises a number of really important points. Andrew, I'm going to come on to you in a moment, so if you wouldn't mind. But so you probably can't read what the principles are here very well. They're all on the website. But I think one thing that, as we were discussing amongst ourselves, that struck me at least, was that looking at the set of principles, there are a couple, most of them are things that who could disagree with. Design at scale, design for sustainability, design with the user, all really important things, not always necessarily how things are done in practice, so important to actually make sure that these things are at the forefront when it's happening. But maybe there are two that potentially sound a bit contradictory. So on the one hand, we have Principle 6, which is using open source standards, open data, open source, and open innovation, so everything being very open. providing access to everyone, etc. And then principle 8 about addressing privacy and security. Now, these don't necessarily need to be contradictory, so provided the way in which addressing privacy and security is being addressed appropriately, anonymizing data, making sure that you can't identify individual children within the data set, that you can't identify individual teachers. So if the data are being used at the community level to identify whether or not the schools, children in the schools are actually learning as much as they should and what is it they're learning and what they're not, it's not being used to accuse teachers of not doing their job or of particular children for not performing. So that privacy and security is really important. And I think one thing that struck me in the discussions we were having amongst ourselves was some of the technology platforms weren't using these very basic ethical principles of anonymizing data. So when we're doing research, we would always know that, the first thing you do is you put an ID code. You don't put a teacher or a child's name. And that wasn't always happening. And these data were then going into this outer space cloud thing, and nobody knew who exactly would get access to it, how they were being used. So I think that was, for us, when we were discussing amongst ourselves, a really important thing that was vital to make sure that these data were going to be used in appropriate ways. So if that happens, then the principle of open source is possible and feasible, and can hopefully be used in constructive ways. But Andrew, maybe you could say something about the Aga Khan Foundation Network's experience of developing platforms using technology for data collection and use, and how you see the principles as fitting.
Great. Thanks, Pauline. So I'm Andrew, and I'm one of two global advisors for education from the Aga Khan Foundation headquarters. And when we came into our work around actually questioning what is quality education, and really being struck by the question, why do we care about what we can measure rather than measure what we care about, we needed to co-create with teachers and parents and school leaders and students themselves from our programs in Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Uganda, Kenya, India, and actually create a robust, secure, anonymized data collection system with a reputable and fairly well-resourced technology partner, Salesforce.com. But we said, okay, we don't want to inject a technology right away. And in fact, we pushed Salesforce.com and Salesforce.org to actually take 6 months and work with us to go to each of these countries with us and spend a lot of time having conversations about the pain points that teachers and students and parents were experiencing, saying we actually care about the values and attitudes that are being developed within our societies, but in fact, our quality of education is being measured only by attendance or the end of primary school exams. So how could we create a platform that actually enables an organic approach to not only collecting information, but also defining what we collect? And I think that when we talk about being data-driven, it's also that democratization of what that data means to whom. And so now, after that 6 months, working with Salesforce.org, working with a technology partner, Vera Solutions, actually rolling out a prototype back at those same schools over the last 6 months, we're now ready to go to scale across our 16 countries. And it's that process of inclusion, dialogue, and frankly, patience in the design process, which I think came out very strongly in our reflections.
I think that's really helpful. I think that links particularly here with the principle 1 of designing with the user, but also thinking about the sustainability and the scale. So you can read more about that case study in the document. Yep, Baela.
I just wanted to highlight the...
Close to your mouth.
I just wanted to highlight the case of the Punjab Information Technology Board, and particularly because I just saw that one of our key respondents is in fact over here as well, because we were looking for case studies which were also at scale. So this is a great example of scale because it is reaching out to 52,000 schools, has reached over 2 million students, and gets done every month. This is the literacy and numeracy drive. Bakar Saab, the DG, is here, and I was wondering whether you'd like to say a few words. Can we just have...
Thank you, Baela. There we go. Better. Well, thank you. Pleasure to be here. I think just like Andrew said, it's a lot of patience and a lot of hard work. We started this back in 2014 with a small experiment in about 8 districts where we gave the monitoring officers tablets, which were SEM-enabled. And then we built upon that, so I'll fast forward to 2017, or rather 16, where all of them across Punjab, we've got about 1,000 monitoring officers. These officers today carry tablets, and on this, there's an assessment application. So their initial role was simply to go and to check on facilities and to report back. So we went from a paper-based system to an online system and made it more real-time. But then the next natural add-on was to do something about assessment, just basic trends in literacy and numeracy. So we built an app where the monitoring officer polls 6 to 7 students in every class. I won't give away the presentation. I think Baela will talk about it more. But it has been a phenomenal experience, and it's incredible how quickly technology's uptake took place in this region, following most of what I see here on the standards. And all of them are important points.
Thank you. I was just pleased to see you. I didn't know you were here, and really delighted that, you know, we have a case study from the public sector as well. And in our all of us working towards the creation of the global public good, particularly in this space.
So I think that the fourth case study, so we've heard from 3 of the case studies. The fourth case study was actually from the Varkey Foundation itself, but I think we don't have the representative here from that, so you can read more about it. But what we were aware of when we started on our journey last year, and actually, interestingly, we were hoping that Salesforce would be part of the alliance, but that wasn't possible for one reason or another. So we were there as more at the end of those that are interested in collecting the data and wanting to use the data in the education system, but none of us had the expertise from the technology side. So it would be wonderful if I might put you on the spot to just ask you if you might say a few words about your experience of how you've worked with the digital principles, whether they've been useful, etc.
Okay. So very briefly, I mean, if you look at all the principles, they kind of lead into each other. So if you start kind of following them, one thing leads to the other. So if you design with the user, you have to understand the existing ecosystem, and if you've done that right, it will be more sustainable. So one thing we do as well is we do use open source and open standards, so we work in education. So that means we work with a lot of ministries of education. It means they're not locked in to using our system. So if they decide at a later date, let's use Moodle or something else, they can do that. Yeah, so I think design with the user for us is we look at the devices that people already have and know how to use and support those. So we wouldn't do an iPad dump in Malawi or something like that, for example. That's, part of understanding the existing ecosystem and also understanding gender differences. So where we work in Afghanistan, a lot of the time, female students won't have mobile data, so we have to make sure everything runs offline and is transferable offline. So that's kind of how we use the principles.
Excellent. No, that's really helpful. Thank you. I should just be honest, because when we again started on our journey, we knew that we thought we wanted principles or guidelines, and as colleagues who were on the Alliance will remember, we were discussing amongst ourselves, well, should we sort of establish guidelines? Are we ready to do that? Do we know? And then we saw that we actually had them ready-made. And I think as soon as we saw these principles, we thought, these are exactly what we were looking for, and somebody else has done all the work for us. So then it leads into the next stage of how can we make sure that those that are designing, using technology for data collection in some form or another, whether it's sort of the NGOs, the government, or others who are wanting to collect these data, working with tech companies, how can we make sure that we do follow these principles? Is there a way that we can make sure that we sign up to them, so on the website for the principles, you'll see some organizations like UNICEF, the UK Department for International Development, these big organizations say that they endorse these principles. What does that actually mean in practice? And how can we make sure they are followed? Because at least when we looked at them in relation to our case studies, they seem to certainly be fit for purpose. So we have about 10 minutes, and maybe we can open up for any questions or comments if other experiences would be really interesting to hear, in particular from the tech companies themselves.
Thanks. So my name is Kago, and I work with NS Education in Kenya, Ghana, and Ivory Coast. And I wanted to give the perspective of a for-profit education tech company. So we follow all the principles except number 6, because my investors don't want me to open source our platform and the algorithms that we use to determine students' learning paths. And I think that for us has been a challenge, because even in academia, you can't do certain research without sort of, like giving revenue share and stuff. So for us, Principle 6 is really the barrier to sort of everyone being able to learn from each other, so that we're not just replicating the same thing over and over again.
So I think that's a really interesting point, because as you say, from a research perspective, having access to data, being able to replicate, being able to see that you're seeing the same thing, being able to learn, and I think that relates to the last principle as well, doesn't it, in terms of collaboration. And as you were saying, they all flow on from each other. It then potentially undermines that. So perhaps that's something important for us to, how can we learn from that? How can we make sure investors do actually see the importance of that?
How do we get corporates to come on board? And I think in that sense also it's been interesting that here is a public sector institution which is doing precisely that, and is completely open source and is making it into a public good, and is wanting to actually work not just across the country with other provinces, but even globally. So Mr. Wakar is sitting there, and if anybody wants to further have a kind of a sharing on how to connect to this open source, there he is, and they're doing absolutely brilliant job, not just in education, but in multiple sectors. So there's an interesting example, but we do want to urge corporate sector to participate, and there is a lot of corporate sector presence here on how do we look at education solutions and learning solutions where we can truly leapfrog. There was somebody else with another question.
Hello. Yes, my name's Charles Waz. I'm the founder of Zish. So we're a platform for real-time insight in the classroom, and we're just starting to build out our real-time insight at the district and national levels. I think I was reading through your reports, I think it's really covered by Principle 5, be data-driven, but we really think it's important to focus everything you do on actionable insight. And that's key to everything we do. A lot of data-driven projects and dashboards just have lots of data, and that isn't useful to anybody. So I just wanted to make that point, really. To us, it's all about actual insight, giving somebody data that they can actually make decisions based on.
And I think, so I think that also links with Principle 1 on designing with the user, so it's actually useful to the user in the first place, isn't it? So were you aware of these principles before?
I wasn't aware of these principles, no. I mean, I think I'd probably echo what other people have said, which is they all make massive sense. I think one of the things we struggle with a company is particularly open standards are often poorly designed, actually, and then that really restricts their usability. So we tend to ignore open standards and just implement our own much simpler APIs for people to use.
Any other comments or questions? Does the tracker meet these principles? He does. You missed the beginning bit where I was asking who knows how these data are being used.
I did get actually a report on how many addresses and emails I had exchanged, how many contacts I had made. So obviously it's tracking me, all right. So one of the things that we were discussing, we said, okay, so what will be the key takeaways from here? And Pauline said, just awareness of the digital principles, I think, is very important. But secondly, also, we hope that when you get an opportunity to look at these case studies, we'll be able to make many more connections and we'd be able to see how we can take it from here and what can be done. I remember when we were doing the investigation and collaborating with the Punjab Information Technology Board, we were asking them, so what is your biggest challenge? And they said, the data gets accumulated because they're doing on facilities, enrollment, and learning. But while for facilities and enrollments being used through a stock take, which takes place, I think, every 3 months across the province. But on learning how effective it is at the classroom level, at the school level, that is still something which is up for grabs. No.
I've been working, I work with UNESCO, and I've been working in the Gulf states for a few years. And in the Gulf states, there are several centers. For example, the Regional Center for ICT and Development in Bahrain, in Manama. And they are really doing enormous work. So I don't know if you want to link up with some of these, because there are very rapid social transformations taking place in this region. And use of new information technologies, it's very, very rapid. So, for example, they took all the materials from the SDGs for raising awareness amongst children, and they're also collecting data from schools. And now, to what extent are they available within the ministry intra site rather than open source? I'm not sure about that. But there are exciting examples, and there's a lot happening in this region in particular. So I just wanted to flag that out.
So I think as much as us being in contact with them, maybe you could send them the principles, because I think this is one of the things that a lot is happening. It's happening very rapidly. New people are coming into the space, but sometimes one also needs to take a step back and say, are we doing things in an appropriate and responsible way that is ultimately going to address the key challenge that we're all here to address, of making sure that all children have access to good quality education and that data are being used responsibly in order to inform and get us to that stage. So thank you for your engagement. Baela, I don't know if you've got any last word before we wrap up.
I think I just wanted to thank one of our colleagues, I don't know if she's here or not, Shajia Sarfraz, who kept us on our toes and did an enormous amount of work. Certainly all the 4 institutions who provided the case studies. A huge round of applause for all of you for doing a marvelous job and putting up with us. But certainly we want this to extend to being extremely inclusive, and I hope children who are with disabilities will also be covered with things like this, and we'll have more and more in this space, other than, of course, making the dissemination of the digital principle really wide through all of you. Thank you so much for being here.